Welcome to Beyond the Grave, where darkness and the unknown collide. Join us on a spine-tingling journey through the chilling realms of the supernatural. Prepare to be haunted by eerie tales, ghostly encounters, and the unexplained mysteries that lurk in the shadows. Subscribe now, if you dare, and let's unravel the secrets that lie beyond the grave together. Hope you would enjoy the 1-hour scary story compilation on our channel. Subscribe our channel, and press the bell icon for more disturbing and chilling scary stories. Rain pelted the windows of my dilapidated apartment as I rifled through the heap of unpaid bills and junk mail on the kitchen counter. The blinking light on my ancient answering machine indicated a new message. Odd. Not many people knew this number. Hitting play. A chilling, distorted voice rasped, "You're invited to the grand Halloween ball. Tonight. Midnight. Don't be late." The message ended with a soft, mocking giggle. For a moment, I simply stood still, confusion etched on my face. Halloween? That rang a bell. A distant memory of a children's Halloween book I'd loved as a kid, filled with mischievous spirits and their whimsical world. But why would anyone invite me to a ball based on it? It had to be a prank. Shrugging it off, I went about my evening, but the thought of Halloween nagged at the back of my mind. Later, while tossing and turning in bed, my alarm clock read 11:47 p.m. Suddenly, there was a crisp knock at the door. Knock, knock, knock. My heart rate quickened. Who could possibly be at my door at this hour? Peering through the peephole, I found no one, but a glint of gold on the ground caught my attention. Leaning down, I retrieved a golden envelope. The front read simply, "For you." Tearing it open, a thick card slid out, detailing the exact address of the Halloween ball. The bottom read, "Dress appropriately." Compelled by a mixture of nostalgia and morbid curiosity, I quickly threw on a makeshift costume. My grandfather's old war uniform would have to do. At least it had the appearance of effort. The address led me to a grand, Gothic mansion nestled between the towering skyscrapers of downtown. The place seemed to swallow all light, casting an eerie shadow that seemed impossibly dark given the urban surroundings. The mansion's imposing door creaked open before I could knock, revealing a cavernous hall. It was awash with a sea of masked guests in ornate costumes, dancing to a haunting, unfamiliar tune. Everything was a blend of the modern urban world and twisted Halloween elements. The chandeliers were adorned with miniature skeletons, all holding tiny glowing candles. Guests dined on hors d'oeuvres that seemed to squirm on the trays. And the music? Played by a band of spectral figures. A woman dressed in rags, with eyes like a raven's, approached. "You're late," she hissed. I looked at my watch. It was a minute past midnight. I didn't think this was real," I stammered. "Never doubt Halloween," she said, her voice dripping with malice. Suddenly, the room's atmosphere shifted. I became intensely aware of the hundreds of eyes piercing into me, the weight of their stares like chains around my neck. "Let the games begin," announced a voice. Looking towards the source, my eyes widened in shock. An impossibly tall figure in a tattered tailcoat, with a grotesque pumpkin for a head, loomed above the guests. It was the spirit from the book, the King of Halloween. "Find the intruder," the Pumpkin King ordered, his voice echoing throughout the mansion. The realization hit me hard. I was the intruder. The guests began to murmur, their conversations turning into whispers of excitement. They started to close in on me. I could hear their eerie voices. "There he is." My heart raced. Desperate, I darted into the nearest corridor, but it twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. Doors lined the hallway, each one leading to a room more terrifying than the last. One was filled with monstrous children reading grotesque versions of fairy tales. Another room was a maze of mirrors, each reflection showing me a more decrepit and monstrous version of myself. Thud, thud, thud. The footsteps of the pursuing guests grew louder, their shadows creeping ever closer. I tried to scream for help, but no sound emerged. My voice was lost, trapped within the walls of this haunting mansion. Every corner I turned seemed to take me deeper into the bowels of this place. Spotting an open window at the end of the corridor, I sprinted towards it. As I leaped out, a cold hand grazed my ankle, almost pulling me back in. The wind howled as I plummeted, bracing for impact. But instead of hitting the ground, I found myself suspended in an endless void. The urban skyline of the city seemed distorted, with the buildings contorting into grotesque faces that mocked my predicament. Was this the end? Would I be trapped in this twisted realm forever? The sensation of falling was disorienting. My eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, to ground me. Instead, I found myself descending into a vast, cobblestone labyrinth. The walls were impossibly high, and everything was bathed in a sickly green glow. No sooner had I landed on my feet than I heard a scuttling sound echoing from the depths of the maze. In the distance, I could make out hunched figures, their eyes glinting menacingly. The memories from the Halloween book flooded back. This was the labyrinth of lost souls. I needed to find the center and escape before the creatures caught me. My breath fogged in front of me as I ran, taking every turn instinctively. The labyrinth was a tangle of misleading passages and dead ends, with grotesque statues of crying children dotted throughout. Each statue seemed to whisper my name, their stone fingers reaching out for a touch. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a clearing. In its center stood an old fountain, but instead of water, it spewed a dark, thick substance. Beside the fountain, there was a pedestal with an open book, the Halloween Guide. It seemed to have pages detailing rituals and incantations. Flipping through it, I found a sketch of the labyrinth with markings and symbols, suggesting a path. Emboldened, I followed the path indicated in the book. With every turn, the air grew colder, and the walls of the maze seemed to close in. It felt as though the very essence of the labyrinth was trying to consume me. Soon, I reached another clearing. This one had a large iron gate adorned with carvings of anguished faces. I tried to push the entrance to the heart of the labyrinth, but it wouldn't budge. Then the realization hit. The door required a sacrifice. Remembering the guide, I thumbed through its pages. One particular ritual caught my attention. It required a personal item and a recitation. Without hesitation, I pulled off my grandfather's war medal, which I had pinned to my uniform earlier, and placed it on a stone altar in front of the gate. Spirits of Halloween, heed my plea, bound by blood, set me free. Take this token, my legacy's mark. Guide me through the shadows and darkness. As I chanted, the metal melted into the altar, and the gate creaked open, revealing a swirling vortex. But the victory was short-lived. The scuttling grew louder and more urgent. The creatures of the labyrinth were close, their hungry whispers filling the air. I took a deep breath and stepped into the vortex. It enveloped me, and I was hurtled through a tunnel of memories, forgotten moments from my childhood, past regrets, and joys, all swirling in a chaotic dance. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I found myself back in the mansion's grand hall. But something was different. It was silent. The guests were frozen in place, their twisted faces turned towards the grand staircase. Atop the stairs stood the Pumpkin King, his hollow eyes fixed on me. "You escaped the labyrinth," he hissed. "No one has done that in centuries. But your trials have just begun." A murmur of anticipation filled the room. The frozen figures began to move, slowly turning their heads to face me. The weight of their gaze was suffocating. The suffocating silence was palpable. Every guest in the room stared, their expressions twisted between anger, curiosity, and a perverse kind of excitement. But it was the Pumpkin King's hollow gaze that was most unsettling, burning into my very soul. "Welcome back," he sneered. "Did you enjoy the depths of Halloween? What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice surprisingly steady. His hollow eyes narrowed. "It's not what I want. It's what you want. You entered our realm willingly, but no one leaves without paying the price." As he spoke, a massive banquet table appeared in the center of the room. On it were countless delicacies, all grotesque and macabre. Broken fingers, eyes in gelatin, hearts still beating. It was a feast straight from a nightmare. "Eat," the Pumpkin King commanded. The mere thought of consuming such horrors made my stomach churn. I hesitated, looking around for an escape, but the guests closed in, forming an impenetrable ring. "This is your final trial," he continued. "Consume the feast, and you may leave Hallowink. Refuse, and join the banquet for the next unfortunate soul." A desperate idea took root. The Hallowink guide recalling an incantation I glimpsed earlier, I began to chant, "Realm of spirits, shadows, and kinks, hear my plea and break these links. By the power of old and new, return me from the world of Hallowink's rue." A powerful wind began to swirl around the room, ripping the grotesque feast from the table, and sending the ghostly guests into a frenzied whirlwind. The Pumpkin King roared in fury, but his voice was drowned by the rising tempest. The world around me started to blur and warp. The grandeur of the mansion faded, replaced by the familiar setting of my apartment. The chilling wind, the echoing screams, and the Pumpkin King's furious roars began to fade, replaced by the comforting sound of rain against the windows. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. It was over. In the morning, I'd convinced myself it was all a dream, a figment of my overactive imagination, influenced by childhood memories of the Hallowink book. But as I left for work, I found something that sent chills down my spine. My grandfather's war medal, slightly scorched and bent, lying on my doorstep. As the days turned into weeks, I did my best to forget the ordeal and push the memories of that night to the back of my mind. But every now and then, when the wind howled in a particular way or shadows danced just out of sight, I couldn't shake off the feeling that the realm of Hallowink was just a heartbeat away. And so, as another Halloween approached, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting an invitation to another sinister ball, reminding me that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Sometimes your eyes play tricks on you when it's dark. At least that's what I told myself the first time I saw one of them. I had been in my hometown this week visiting my parents when I got a text from an old friend. "Hey Jay, I know you're busy, man," it read, "but Cam is home too, and I thought we could order some food and watch the game. I have never been big on sports, but I hadn't seen Will in well over a year and Cam in even longer. On the way out the door, my mom told me to be safe. Text her when I get there. All the usual. Will lives pretty far back into the woods, and it took me a while to get there." After being chastised a bit for being late, we threw a pizza in the oven and sat down. We spent more time talking about what we'd been up to than watching the game, which was fine by me. Time always flies among good company, and before I knew it, it was well after midnight. "James, just stay dude. I already cleaned the futon." First of all, I've slept enough nights on that futon to know how bad my back will hurt in the morning. Second, I promised my parents I'd make them breakfast in the morning. After a little more complaining from them, we finally said our goodbyes and made the yearly promise that we will really keep in touch this time. Seeing that it was very late, and there were no streetlights for miles, I threw on my high beams and started making my way home. I always have a bit of an uneasy feeling driving dark roads at night, so I opened my phone to put on some music. After 30 seconds of buffering, I remembered how horrible my service was out here and turned off my phone. It was shortly after that when I saw it. In my peripheral vision, I swore I saw a person standing a few yards off the side of the road. A quick glance at my rearview mirror showed nothing of interest and put my mind at ease. Sometimes your eyes play tricks on you when it's dark. I should really start wearing my glasses when I drive. The moment I finished scolding myself, it happened again. A person standing perfectly still on the side of the road. I only caught a glimpse, but this time I was positive I wasn't seeing things. Another look at my mirrors yielded the same result as before, but I knew what I saw. Instinctually, I stepped on the gas a little. I knew these roads like the back of my hand, and I could afford to speed for my peace of mind. Unfortunately, all the peace of mind in the world could not have prepared me for what I saw next. My driver's side mirror exploded as the face of a small girl flew past my window. I slammed on my brakes before I could think. My heart was beating out of my chest as I came to grips with what had just happened. Where had she come from? I may not be the most blessed visually, but I knew that there was nobody in the road for me to have hit. As stupid as it may sound, I stepped out of my car to check on the girl. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I committed a hit and run. My stomach did a flip when I looked up to see nothing. No little girl, no remnants of my mirror, not even fallen twigs or leaves. The road was bare. Thoroughly scared at this point, I scrambled back into my car and shut the door, barely noticing that my mirror was back in its place, unscathed. That was until I saw a white spot in the corner of my vision. I looked into my newly returned mirror to see two pale figures in plain clothes standing in the tree line maybe 30 feet behind my car. They didn't seem to move. I couldn't make out details in the low light, but I could feel their gazes fixed on me, burning holes through me. I lost control of my body as I felt my foot try to push the gas pedal through the floor. I had never understood how intense true fight or flight is until that moment. I stole another glance at my mirror, and yet again the figures had disappeared. There was a lull, and I took a moment to breathe and get my bearings. I saw a small country billboard that I knew was about halfway between my parents' house and Will's. It had a small light on top to make the advertisement visible at all hours. This brought me a brief moment of comfort that was quickly shattered when I saw what looked like a pair of bare feet below the sign. As I drove past, I turned around, and to my horror, there was a man, backlit by the dim glow of the sign. This man was unnaturally tall and gaunt. His facial features were hidden to me, but like before I could feel whatever it was staring daggers into my soul. My knuckles turned white, and I thought I might snap the steering wheel in half from how hard I was gripping it. I told myself that no matter what, I would not look in my mirrors again before I made it home. My foot still pressed firmly to the floor. I concentrated on the dark, unmarked pavement. It took all my willpower not to look at the things I saw in the corners of my vision. I was so focused on avoiding my mirrors that it took me almost half a minute to notice the bright red and blue glow that filled them. Realizing what I was seeing, I was brought back down to earth. As much as it pained me, I pulled over into the shallow ditch that lined the road. A shout filled the air as I rolled down my window. "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" Before I could answer, the officer spoke again, more concerned than angry this time. "James, Christ alive, son, are you trying to kill someone? Why are you driving like a goddamn maniac?" Officer Wilcox was a good friend of my father. Those two used to spend nights in our den, drinking and discussing what new gun they bought that week. I thanked God that he was the one to pull me over. "Sir, I am so sorry. What was I going to tell him? That I hit a little girl with my car and ran because I saw something scary in the dark. He would think I'm a fucking lunatic. I was being chased. A car without their lights on was following me until probably a mile back. I know I should have called it in. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Not very believable, but the best I could come up with. Jesus, kid, I don't even know what to say to that. Have you has anything to drink or taken anything tonight? "No, sir. A lie. I'd had 2 beers a few hours prior. I really am sorry. I was just so scared and didn't know what to do." "All right, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and let you off with a warning." I breathed a sigh of relief before he finished. "On the condition that tomorrow you come to the station and make a written statement about the incident." Lying to a family friend was one thing, but lying under oath was another thing entirely. I thought for a moment before agreeing to his terms. It was stupid, but it was the choice that got me off this God-forsaken road and behind the locked doors of my parents' house the fastest. He told me that he would drive back the way I came and look for anything suspicious and sent me on my way. All of my anxiety flooded back as he shut his lights off and disappeared from view. Despite that, I also knew that he would be the only officer on duty, and I wouldn't have to worry about my speed for the rest of the drive. I put my foot back to the floor, flying through intersections that I knew would be empty and catching air a few times over the small hills that dotted the road. My car was taking a beating, but I had to get home. I don't know if it was because I was so hyper-focused on the road, or if there was truly nothing to see for the rest of the ride home. But by the time I reached my driveway, I had not seen another one of the figures. That realization did not help with the massive pit that the thought of walking to my front door created in my stomach. I had never been more afraid than at that moment. Eventually, I psyched myself up enough to make a break for it. I opened my door and ran as fast as I could onto the front porch. While I fumbled to find my house key, I looked over my shoulder out of habit. As far as I could tell, there was nothing to be seen. The neighborhood was as it usually was at this hour, quiet and deserted. As I turned back around, I felt all the air leave my body. In the reflection of the storm door, I saw two pale hands on my shoulders and a twisted face towering over my head. I woke up in the back of an ambulance, screaming. My mother had found me unconscious on the porch, bleeding from a gash where I had hit my head on the way down. Nobody believes me when I try to explain what happened. I write this as Officer Wilcox and a quiet man in a suit sit and wait for me to finish. I don't know what they were, but I know that they were real. And I know that I don't drive at night anymore. When my friend first introduced me to the dark web, I was amazed at how such an unknown thing could house some of the most illegal things on Earth. Up until today, I had only used it for learning how to code and commit small crimes, but after the horrifying videos I just found, I don't think I'll ever use the dark web again. I first met my best friend Alex when a little bit after I got into high school. My parents had moved us to a new town and I had no friends. It was lonely at first, but I got used to it. We moved because they were paranoid after many murders occurred in our town. I thought this was weird, moving across the country over that, but I let it go. The reason Alex and I became friends so quickly was because we both had a shared interest in the internet and everything it had to offer. I was a gaming addict and a Tier 3 Pokemon subscriber, while he was more of a coder and developer. 2 years later, we were still best friends, but now we were much older and smarter. Alex had discovered the dark web and he was obsessed with it. He pretty much spent every hour of the day on it, searching through anything you could imagine. There was nothing wrong with this, but one search he made was the biggest mistake of his entire life. I remember waking up to dozens of text messages from him one morning. This wasn't normal. Alex wasn't a very social person, and it was very hard to get words out of him. I opened my phone to see what he had messaged me. "Dude, Jack, you have to come over right now. This is important. Jack, please wake up. This is urgent. Where are you?" These were only some of the messages, but the rest were very similar, with them all being urgent, and that I needed to go to his house immediately. My parents were both at work still, so I went over to Alex's house. When I arrived, there were 4 cop cars parked in front of his house, and there were dozens of people and news vans standing out front. I made my way through the crowd, and Alex's mother told the police to let me inside. I could see tears rolling down her cheeks as she opened the door. "What's going on, Mrs. Gonzalez?" I asked. "Alex missing," she said as she started crying. My heart sank. How could this happen? He had just texted me earlier that morning. That was when it hit me. What if he was trying to warn me? What if his text messages were related to his disappearance? Still in shock, I walked up to one of the detectives in the kitchen. "Is Alex going to be okay?" I asked. "Of course he is. He's going to be just fine. We're going to find him very soon," one of the detectives responded. Something about that response was off. It was like I knew he was wrong. Deep down, I had this slight feeling that I wasn't going to see him ever again. I remembered the text messages, however, and pulled out my phone to show it to the detective. He texted me this morning. What if this has something to do with him going missing? I said swiftly. As he began reading them, his expression quickly changed. It was like it got worse. He told me they needed to keep my phone for now to investigate the text messages, and said they would give it back to me later. I stayed around the house for a while, not just because I missed Alex, but because I wanted to comfort his parents. They cared about me a lot, and it hurt to see them like that. His mother couldn't stop crying. Eventually, however, I went into Alex's room to see if I could find anything that might give a clue about why he went missing. I searched through everything, but I found nothing. But then I noticed something. Alex's computer was on, but his monitor was turned off. I looked for the button to turn it on and hit it. As the screen lit up, my heart sank. He was on the dark web. Obviously, this was normal, but for some reason, he had dozens of different tabs opened. I knew this part wasn't normal, so I closed the door and locked it, and began going through them. At first, it was all pretty usual for him, but then things started to get weird. He had a tab open that was an article about a murder that had happened several years ago. The article said that it was a woman who was found dead in her apartment. Her body was mutilated, cut up, and covered in acid. I nearly threw up reading it and seeing the horrifying pictures of the crime scene. Not wanting to see any of it anymore, I switched the tab just to reveal another article about another murder. Confused, I quickly went through the rest of the tabs he had open, and they were all the same thing. They all were about some type of murder or crime. The one that stuck out the most to me, however, was one about a murder that had happened 2 years ago. At first, it seemed pretty normal, but as I read further, I realized what it was. It was about the murder of our neighbor that prompted us to move away. Confusion quickly swept over me. How did Alex know about this? I never told him about it, because to me, it wasn't that important. I figured it must have just been a strange coincidence, but then I saw the last search he had made on his computer. It was my last name. Horrified and confused, I quickly stumbled out of his room and back to the living room. Is everything all right? Alex's mother said, sniffing away her tears. Yeah, I just need to go home for dinner, I responded. On the way home, so many questions and thoughts filled my mind. Why was he searching up my last name? Did he think that I had something to do with this? That must have been why he was texting me so frantically that morning. If only I could just explain to him that I didn't do anything wrong. But I couldn't. He was still missing, and I had to find out why. When I got home, I raced to my room and slammed the bedroom door shut and got on my computer. I loaded up my Tor browser and turned my VPN on. I knew what I had to do. I began typing in the letters of my last name, becoming more nervous after every letter. When I finally hit enter, nothing happened. It was just a blank screen. Confused, I refreshed the page, but once again, there was nothing. But why did Alex search this if there was nothing? I thought to myself. There must be something out there. I was getting ready to close the tab, thinking I had ran into a dead end, when suddenly, the page started to load. It took several minutes, but finally, it loaded to reveal hundreds of videos. Immediately, I knew what they were. They were murders, but why did they show up when you searched my last name? I considered just stopping right there and turning back, knowing the horrifying things I would see if I continued on, but I couldn't. I knew this had to be why Alex went missing, so I clicked on the first video. As it started playing, I saw what looked like a woman strapped to a chair in some sort of basement or something. I quickly recognized who it was. It was our neighbor from 2 years ago. I could tell because she had the same heart-shaped tattoo on her neck. She sat there for a minute, struggling, panicking, and screaming for someone to help. However, suddenly, 2 figures walked into frame. At first, I couldn't tell who they were, but as they turned around to face the camera, my heart sank. It was my parents. My father was holding a knife, while my mother was holding a small scalpel. They paused for a moment before they started what was the most horrifying 5 minutes of my entire life. I watched as they cut her into pieces and listened as she begged for mercy, screaming the whole time. Blood filled the room as she took her last breath. When the video ended, it quickly went to another, revealing the exact same room and chair I had seen before. I was traumatized by what I had already seen, and I knew I couldn't watch any more of it. My parents were murderers, and I now knew the real reason we moved away 2 years ago. I knew there was something off about that, but I just never could have imagined that this was the horrifying secret that they had been hiding from me. This whole time I thought Alex was trying to accuse me of being responsible for these murders, but I was so wrong. He was trying to warn me. I scanned through more of the videos, each in the exact same room. I was just about finished, ready to go to the police so that I could tell them about what I had just seen when I noticed something. There was a new video uploaded today on the website. I quickly clicked on it and pressed play to reveal what looked like a man this time, strapped to the chair. He had a sack over his face, and I couldn't tell who it was. Once again, however, I saw my parents walk into the frame. My father walked up to the man and pulled the sack off his head. At first, I couldn't tell who it was, but then I realized who I was looking at. It was Alex. It's always been a dream of mine to run off to some podunk town where I could find a big piece of land for cheap and build up my own quiet slice of paradise. I envisioned finishing up a hard day of chores and seeing the light softly kissing each leaf on a tree, emitting a lambent yellow glow that soothes the soul. I knew that each moment wouldn't be as beautiful as my daydream, but I never imagined how truly off-base my reality would turn out to be. I should probably start by telling you what brought me to the farm in the first place. I had a successful career and wasn't hurting for anything. But then one day I got the heartbreaking news that my wife had been in an accident. Whenever the two of us felt life had gotten too overwhelming, we'd joke about escaping the hustle and bustle and moving out to the country, getting a few cows, chickens, and baby goats, and living the simple life instead. When faced with the most overwhelming moment of my life, I felt like there was only one option for me. I couldn't bear to return to our shared home, let alone our routined life, while staring into such a gaping black hole that ripped into each familiar place. Our lives died with her, and I found myself draining my bank accounts, selling off everything, and packing up my essentials and a few keepsakes to bring with me into the unknown in honor of everything I had loved. I arrived in the town that would become my new home, just as the sun crested the hills on the horizon. I drove down the long road leading toward Main Street with my windows rolled down, feeling the brisk morning air tussle my hair while country played quietly on the radio. As I pulled onto Main Street, I spotted locals funneling hungrily into what I'd come to find was the local breakfast spot. The town seemed to congregate around this one small hole-in-the-wall restaurant, and I decided to park and join the droves. I walked into the cafe and was immediately hit by the smell of sizzling bacon and coffee. The atmosphere was jovial, with people packed in like sardines, while sharing a certain camaraderie I hadn't seen since my childhood. It felt instantly like home, and for a short time I felt the heavy, dark clouds that loomed over me evaporating. For the first time since I'd received the news that ruined me, I felt hopeful that I would find a place in the world again after feeling so lonely. I waited for a bar stool at the counter to open up, and once I'd finally got a seat, my stomach was growling like a grizzly that hadn't had a meal all winter. I ordered the biggest breakfast plate on the menu while the smiling waitress filled a cup with a steaming stream of coffee. "You must be the guy that took over Mama M's old farm," she said to me, her eyes earnestly searching my face for any glimmer of information. I wondered who Mama M was, but knew enough to know that I'd taken possession of the only farm in the area. "I guess so," I mused, smirking while taking a big gulp of the bitter brown liquid. "You must be brave," she said to me, with a knowing look in her eyes. I didn't know how to respond. I opted for a shrug and a smile, and she moved on to the next hungry customer. Her silence left a strange pit in my gut that I couldn't quite place, and I ended up chalking it up to hunger. My plate arrived quickly, and I devoured every last morsel and crumb, truly becoming a member of the Clean Plate Club. I found myself wondering if this is how farmers always ate when the man next to me, who had been eyeing me for the entirety of my visit to the cafe, decided to finally strike up a conversation. "You bought Mama M's old spot?" he inquired. I didn't know how to answer. I still had no idea who Mama M was. "I bought the old farm down on Willow," I decided to answer. He seemed satisfied with that and offered a knowing grunt. He seemed to need time to answer. "Don't bring any goats onto that land," he offered after a few moments of silence. "I wanted to get some baby goats," I replied. "Don't." One of Mama M's rules was to never have goats. We always knew to listen to Mama M, and you'd do well to listen to her too. I nodded, but in my mind, Mama M sounds like an old bat. I didn't give much weight to the warning because, as far as I was concerned, the land was mine now and I could do what I wanted with it. The stranger seemed to read my thoughts. "I'm telling you, don't buy any goats. They're more trouble than they're worth." With his words, he stood up and threw $15 onto the counter, nodded to me, and worked his way through the crowd waiting for a table and out the door. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. I made my way to my plot of land with its rundown house, barn, and chicken coop. All three structures could use a little love. I decided to unpack and evaluate everything the next morning, deciding I could do with a good bit of sleep before embarking on my new journey. In the middle of the night, I awoke to a noise. In my sleep fog, I couldn't immediately recognize it, but I quickly registered the scratching right above my left ear. I figured there must be mice in the walls, and quickly succumbed once again to sleep. When I awoke, the sun was streaming in through the derelict curtains, poking me in the eyes as if they were a white-hot fire poker. I struggled out of bed, looking at my phone, which read 9:12 a.m. I'd slept much later than I meant to and sprung out of bed, knowing I had to evaluate the buildings before my scheduled animal deliveries arrived. Most people wouldn't dive headfirst into the farming deep end, but I wanted to get into my new life right away. I was in the barn patching a few holes in the siding when the animals arrived. I had bought a rooster, a few hens, a few cows, and multiple, varying colors of baby goats. The stranger's warning registered in my mind once again, but I shrugged it off and accepted the delivery without objection. I got acquainted with my animals, and my favorite goat was the one that was jet black and seemed to speak to me with every noise he made. After settling the animals into their new homes, I was sufficiently tired and decided to retire to my room for the night. I could feel a storm rolling in and made sure that everyone was safe and sound before wandering to my room and hunkering down. I awoke with a start, assuming the culprit was thunder when I heard the scratching again. But this time, it was more earnest, more insistent. It even sounded panicky if I listened closely enough. The mouse must really want out of those walls. Maybe it smelled like food. Maybe it had just gotten used to the house being empty. Either way, I wasn't that worried about it, but for some reason I wasn't able to fall back to sleep. The scratching persisted and even got louder as it continued on and on. Unrelenting, whatever was in the wall insisted on getting to me. I decided to get up and get a glass of water since it didn't seem like I'd be getting sleep anytime soon. As I stumbled down the stairs and through the dark halls, something caught my eye just out the window. There stood a figure, completely unmoving. At first, I thought it was just a figment of my sleepy imagination, but I rubbed my eyes and looked again, and there it stood, completely still. I couldn't make out much except for the silhouette. It stood tall, with horns, knotty knees, and arms that ended in 2 points instead of 5. I rubbed my eyes again, willing the vision away, and looked to find that my hopes had been dashed, and the figure was still there. I couldn't tear my eyes away, and as I stared, I began to hear the scratching again, knowing that though I saw the silhouette in front of me, there may be others working, trying to get through the walls to me. Bang! Something hammered on the walls, and I no longer felt safe in my little slice of paradise. I glanced out the window again, and the silhouette was nowhere to be seen. Bang, bang, bang. The sound continued to shake the thin walls of my house, making me question the integrity of the building and wonder if they could break through. Bang, bang, bang. The sound continued, more insistently shaking the walls around me, when suddenly it came to an abrupt halt. I held my breath, wondering if the insistent sound would resume. I sat staring out the window, straining for any glimpse of the figure I could get, until the sun once again crested the surrounding hills. This time, I didn't feel the same warmth I'd felt when I found the restaurant. Instead, I felt a persistent itch to find out who Mama M was and exactly why I couldn't have goats on my farm. I thought about immediately getting rid of them, but I can't bear to until I get answers, especially from my jet-black little friend, who greeted me with a friendly grunt this morning. When I speak to someone, I'll write again, but I feel in my gut that there's something very wrong with this farm. There is a small cabin in the woods outside my hometown. It belonged to a man named Henry Cowlett. He had lived there with his young son. He was a single father, his wife having died of a brain aneurysm 3 years after the birth of their son. By all accounts, he was decent, if understandably melancholic, man who deeply loved his son and still remained deeply loyal to his wife. He always made sure to leave a flower on her grave, every single morning. He never once deviated from this tradition. On the 15th of September, 1877, Henry and his son disappeared from their cabin. A small group of townsfolk, perplexed by Henry's absence, visited the cabin to check up on him and his son. They found the living room in disarray. Blood was soaked into the carpet, a window was broken, the table was overturned, and one of Henry's rifles was found on the floor and had clearly been fired. Undoubtedly, a struggle had taken place. A search party was swiftly arranged, and the woods around my town were scoured for days on end. The search was tireless. The town used every resource at its disposal to find Henry and his boy, but they never were found. The search became hopeless and eventually stopped completely. Henry and his son became mourned ghosts in the community. They had an honorary funeral, and their graves were dug right next to his wife's. What happened to Henry and his son is still debated in our community. Various hypotheses and urban legends have sprung up over the many years since the incident. None of them have been deemed conclusive. Henry's cabin had been mostly left untouched since that dreadful day. The town decided to leave it alone out of respect for the lost members of its little community. I have always been intrigued by this very tragic case, so yesterday I decided to go to the cabin and just take a look around. I set off for Henry's cabin around 10 in the morning. The air was cool, and the sky was half covered with clouds that constantly blocked out the sun as they passed by. Henry's cabin sat all by itself amidst a sea of looming trees. It looked ancient, a building that had stood still in the relentless passage of time. The roof had partially caved in and some of the windows were broken. But otherwise, I'd say it looked just the same as it had the night Henry and his son disappeared. I walked up to the front door, which was caked in moss, lichen, and dust. I then took hold of the knob and gently edged it open. And then I stepped inside. The dark living room had been cleared out. Only a single chair remained. It sat alone in front of the ash and soot-smeared fireplace. To the left of me was the bedroom. I peered in through the doorway. Surprisingly, the 2 bed frames were still there, but the blankets and the mattresses were long gone. I left the bedroom and went to the solitary chair. I checked it for stability, and when it proved still sturdy, I sat down on it. The atmosphere of the cabin was just so heavy. There was certain feel to the air. The type of feeling that puts you on edge and makes goosebumps form on your skin. Some people said the cabin was haunted, and sitting there, all alone in the shadowy living room of the place, I started thinking the same too. I sat there, ruminating, trying to figure out just what had happened to Henry and his son. And then I noticed something in the fireplace. I leaned forward and noticed a small object buried beneath the ash and soot. I grasped it and wiped away all the debris. My eyes then widened. It was a stone carved into the image of an owl. What the hell was it doing in the fireplace? I suddenly felt lightheaded. My vision started to blur, and my limbs became weak. A wave of lethargy overcame me, and eventually I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. Everything went black, and I then felt as though I was floating, as if had become nothing but air, unconfined by my physical body. And then I suddenly felt heat, and smelt burning wood, and heard the crackling of a fire. An image began to form in front of me, like the calming of rippling water. When it finally smoothed out, I found myself still inside the cabin. Only now it wasn't an empty husk. There was fire in the fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, a stove, and a rocking chair in front of the fireplace. I looked to the window. It was nighttime, and it appeared to be snowing outside. The front door then opened, and much to my astonishment, Henry Cowlett walked inside. He was wearing a snow-caked coat and boots, and was holding some firewood beneath his right arm. He wiped his face, and then he brought the wood over to the fireplace and dropped it in. The fire strengthened and casted even more of its orange light across the cabin. Henry removed his coat and boots and set his boots next to the fire, and then he laid his frozen coat on the table. Then he walked over to the bedroom door and quietly edged it open. And then he peeked inside. He smiled, and then he quietly shut the door. Then he stretched and walked over to the rocking chair and sat down. The glow of the fire engulfed him, and he rested his hands over his stomach. Henry sat there, rocking slightly, gazing into the warm fire. But his peace was then interrupted by 8 loud knocks at the door. He winced a little, surprised by the suddenness of the knocks. "What the hell?" he whispered, letting out an annoyed sigh. Henry got up out of his chair and walked over to the front door and opened it. A woman stood on the other side. A tall, very pale woman with dark marks around her eyes. Her coal-black, shaggy hair fell well past her shoulders and was brushed with snow. She wore no shoes. Her only item of clothing was a deerskin dress and a necklace of beads and carved stones, one of which I quickly recognized as the owl figurine I had discovered in the fireplace. Despite her little clothing, she did not seem to be all that bothered by the cold. She merely stood there, hands limp at her sides, staring her fiery green eyes down at Henry. "May I help you? Are you lost?" asked Henry. "No," the woman replied, her voice low and raspy like an icy wind. Henry leaned to the side of the woman, trying to see past her. He scrutinized the area outside the cabin, and then he looked at the woman again. "Are you with that band down by the river?" he asked. "No," the woman replied. Henry put his hand on his hip and shot a suspicious look at the woman. "Okay then, what the hell are you doing here?" The woman smiled. "I just need to talk to you." The woman pushed past Henry and then took a seat at the table. Henry glared at the woman and then shut the door. "What the hell do you want to talk about? I ain't never met you before." The woman rested her sharply nailed hands on the table. "I knew your grandfather," the woman replied. "What? How'd you know him?" "He never said anything about you." The woman grinned and gestured to the chair across the table. I got a good look at her teeth. They were very sharp looking. Reluctantly, Henry joined the strange woman at the table. "All right, tell me how you know my grandfather," demanded Henry. "He came to me a few nights before your father was born," the woman responded. Henry gave her a perplexed look. "What? You don't look all that old. Hell, you look younger than I am." The woman smiled. "Let's get back to the topic at hand. You know that nice little ranch you grew up on? You had all of that because of me." "What? You heard me. Your grandfather didn't get that ranch through, well, moral means. You see, he was fighting over the ownership of that ranch with a man from a substantially richer family. He wouldn't have had a chance in hell of getting it without my help. Henry's eyes narrowed. He found out about me from the hushed whispers of some Sokoki hunters he was trading with. They, of course, wouldn't want anything to do with me. But your grandfather, like all your folk, was knave. Henry huffed and clenched his fists. Where the hell are you going with this? Who the fuck are you? Are you some kind of medicine woman? What tribe are you from? Oh, I'm not one of those fools who fail to see the true power in their work. I can't recall which tribe I used to be a part of. It is not something I'm too concerned about, really. My past means nothing to me now. A rustle came from the bedroom, and Henry glanced nervously at the door. A small, sly smile briefly spread on the woman's pallid face. She then continued. As I was saying, your grandfather came to me for assistance, begging me to get rid of the little leech draining his heavenly future away. Being the merciful woman that I am, I took pity upon him and did just as he asked. His rival met a bloody end at the crescent claws of a great bear. The ranch was now your grandfather's, handed to him by me on a gold-encrusted platter. I gave your grandfather everything he'd asked of me. Of course, I needed some compensation for my work. It was reasonable and inexpensive. Your grandfather swore to uphold his end of the bargain. So I waited and waited and waited. But my payment never came. He had lied to me. The woman's hands clenched into fists, and her eyes narrowed. I was reason your grandfather abandoned the ranch when you were 10 cycles old. The reason he hauled you and your mother into these cold woods to hide in the shadows beneath their branches. He knew I wasn't happy. He knew I was going to turn up any day. And I did turn up, to an empty homestead. Denied what was rightfully mine. She said and then nodded to my father. Henry's mouth fell agape, and he edged away from the woman. What do you mean? He asked. You should have been nursed in my arms, she said. What the hell are you talking about? The woman gave a slight grin, and Henry now seemed to notice how sharp her teeth were. The bedroom door then creaked open, and Henry's son stood in the doorway. He looked about 7 years old and was wearing a nightgown. His large blue eyes quickly fell upon the woman, and she looked at him and smiled. Well, my dear Henry, here's your chance to pay your grandfather's debt. Thomas, go back to bed, Henry ordered. No, stay where you are, little one, said the woman, and Thomas stayed where he was. Look at him. Such a sad little thing. A boy his age needs a mother. You clearly don't know a thing about nurturing a child. But then, I guess it isn't your fault. You were raised by that worthless father of yours and his whore. Henry swiftly stood up and glared daggers down at the woman. Get out of my house, you damned she-devil, he hissed, and then he ran over to a drawer and retrieved his hunting rifle from it. He pointed it at the woman and gritted his teeth. You ain't taking my boy. Thomas stood there, shaking. He seemed to be frozen to the spot, either out of fear or some kind of hypnosis the woman had put him under. The woman sat there, staring at the enraged Henry, the man barely constraining his volcanic wrath. The woman sneered, and then she flipped the table onto Henry with uncanny strength and speed. The table slammed into Henry, and his gun went off, and the bullet shattered the window. The table knocked Henry to the ground, and he lay beneath it, winded. His rifle was no longer in his grasp. Now it lay a few feet across the room. The woman stood up, and then she walked over to Henry and brought her foot down onto his arm. A loud crack echoed across the room, and Henry screamed. Don't get up, said the woman coldly. Fuck you, Henry hissed. The woman walked over to Thomas, and then she took him into her arms. Henry growled, and then he pushed the table off himself. And then he got to his feet and charged at her. She spun around with lightning speed and managed to dodge his attempted tackle, but he managed to grab hold of her necklace and tear it away. The beads went all over the floor, and the stone owl went into the smoldering fire. The woman let loose an inhuman growl, and then she launched forward and lashed out with her right hand, and plunged her sharp nails into Henry's chest. He gasped and went still, and a single tear fell from his eye. This didn't have to happen, Henry. Thomas is going with me, whether you like it or not. said the woman. The woman retracted her claws from Henry's chest, and then Henry fell onto his knees, breathing shallowly, his eyes unblinking and wide. "Now sleep, Henry." The woman walked to the door, and both she and Thomas vanished into the icy darkness. Henry fell onto his side and quietly wept. "I'm sorry, Martha. She took Thomas. She took our boy. She took." His voice suddenly stopped. Ice began to form over his face, and his arms, and his clothes. He then lay there, completely frozen for a second, and then he burst into innumerable shards of ice that scattered all around the room and then melted away to nothing. I awoke with a loud gasp on the floor of Henry's cabin. Only now it looked as it did when I first entered it, empty and cold. The stone owl was still in my hand and was now far cleaner than it was when I found it. But then cracks began to grow all around it, and then it completely evaporated into a cloud of dust and disappeared into the air. I dropped my hand to my side, and I lay there on the floor for what felt like hours, ruminating upon what I had just seen. That phantasmal vision the stone owl had somehow inflicted upon me. It was no dream, no hallucination. I now knew what had happened that night, and it was horrifying. I left the cabin and returned to my house. I wanted to tell everyone of what I had seen, but thought back on it. They obviously wouldn't believe me, and that accursed owl stone had withered away before my eyes, so I couldn't use that either. I guess the best thing I can do is put some flowers on Henry's grave and tell him how sorry I was for what happened to him and his son. God, that woman. Henry's father should have heeded the fear of those hunters and not sought out her help. What an idiot he was. I was sitting on the couch, eating dinner while watching television. All of a sudden I heard the house door open, followed by a booming voice. "Hey, honey." "Hello, children. I am back from my trip. I hope you didn't miss me too much." My ears perked up immediately, surprised at his voice coming from the corridor. I quickly left the living room and went to greet him. Skepticism was prevalent in my eyes. I hadn't expected him to come home from his trip so early. I sighed, clearly discontent with something. You see, I was born into a broken family. Being the first child, I was the only one there to witness the good few years of my parents' 17-year marriage. It was an arrangement of both my parents' choice. But the love only lasted until we had my sister. It all began to go downhill from there. The house was always filled with arguments and the screams of my parents. There was never enough money because my father was fired from his job and couldn't get a new one. My mother had to handle all the responsibilities of the house. I came to dislike my father from a really young age. I always knew something was wrong with the man, and he showed his true colors when I turned 10. He started drinking and regularly beat my mom to get money for booze. He even stole our bill money and our savings for it. My mom couldn't deal with it anymore, and she sadly passed away due to stress when I was just 12. I couldn't even do anything to help her. I just stood there silently at her funeral. But then my father had changed. He just went out after my mother's funeral and disappeared for a week. He started a job, looked after me and my sister, and even left booze for good. But I knew that thing wasn't my father. I knew that man from birth, and a devil like him couldn't change. I was sure of it. My suspicions were confirmed one night when I followed him out for his business trip. What I saw there was horrifying. My father, no, that thing who wore his skin, sat hunched on the ground near the forest. Fresh blood was dripping from his mouth, and nearby was a black dog, whimpering silently, blood dripping from a stump where his hind leg should be. I immediately ran back and pretended to never know anything, but he knew that I knew, and so I became his next target. But I am not that easy to hurt. I finally managed to make him sleep again after much struggle, but he came back home. Since then, I have been killing my father every full moon for 3 years now. It was still not a full moon yet, but he had come back somehow. I sighed, dug out a crowbar from my cupboard, and went to his room. I saw him sleep soundly, so I acted swiftly and made him go to sleep again. Hopefully his sleep is eternal this time, I sighed to myself as I took the body to the forest near our house, burying him with the rest. I buried him where I had buried my real father when I killed him at 12, on the way back from my mother's funeral. It was August 23, 2008, and I went out to celebrate my friend Mitchell's 19th birthday. All of our friend group was with us minus 9 to 10 people, and we were all having a good time. It was getting late at around 1 a.m., and that's when we all decided to go home and enjoy our night. I was going back to Mitchell's house for the night. Mitchell lives on the outskirts of the main town in a farmhouse with 250 acres of land surrounding it. His house is roughly 5 miles away from the town center, and we had no form of transportation, so we decided to walk. We got nearly 3 miles into the walk before we heard an ear-piercing screech come from the old cemetery. Mitchell's dad has always told us not to go near that cemetery, no matter what, and he never told us why. But we listened to him as he is 65, weighs 280 pounds, and served in Vietnam. Mitchell looked at me with a scared look on his face and said with a trembling voice, "What was that?" I didn't reply. I just shared the same expression. We started to walk again, but we heard it again. But this time it was louder and closer. I thought the thing that was screaming was right behind me, so when I turned around, I was expecting to see something, but to my shock, nothing. We then realized that the scream was coming from inside the cemetery, and that's when we realized something wasn't right. We both knew that we shouldn't go into the cemetery, but we never knew why. We started arguing over whether we should go in or go home. I convinced him to come into the cemetery with me to check it out. We opened the gate, and as I took the first step into the cemetery, the air went cold and my breath was snatched. And that's when I realized I couldn't turn back now. We carried on walking further and further into the cemetery, trying to find what was making the ear-piercing screech we heard moments ago. 3 minutes went by, and we hadn't found anything. And that's when we decided that we should just go home. We started walking back to the gate, and that's when we heard it again. But this time it was coming from inside the chapel. Neither of us wanted to know what was inside the chapel, so we started running to the gate. We left the gate open for a quick escape if something went wrong. But when we reached the gate, it was locked with a chain and padlock. Our only way out of the cemetery was over the 9-foot wall. We climbed the wall in a matter of seconds out of fear, and as we were just getting over the wall, we saw what was making the noise. To our shock stood a large pale humanoid creature standing at 7 to 8 feet tall. It was abnormally skinny, with freakishly long arms nearly reaching the floor. It was turning the other way, but I knew it could tell that we were there, as it stood exactly where we were standing, looking around. At this moment, it's around 2:45 a.m., and we are not staying out here any longer. The creature turned swiftly, locked eyes with me, and let out another screech. But this time it was deeper than the rest, and then it started to run at us. Me and Mitchell got down from the wall and ran for the next 2 miles back to his house. We got back at 3:10 a.m., and as soon as we got home, we locked all the doors and closed the curtains. We thought we had escaped, but we hadn't. We heard the screech again, but this time it was the same pitch as the first two, and we heard it coming from the surrounding fields. We woke his dad up, and he was confused about why we woke him up. We told him everything, and he looked at us with anger and fear in his eyes, and simply said, "What have you done?" I replied with a shaky voice, "What do you mean?" He looks me in the eyes, and with a cold face says, "It follows you." His dad has a scar going from the top of his leg to the bottom, and he always told us he got it during a football injury, and they had to cut his leg open to fix it. Keep that in mind. We started to panic. His dad went upstairs and told us to stay down here while he got something. We heard a loud rustling noise coming from the side room, which normally has a lock. No one has been in that room, and no one knows what's in it besides his dad. After about 10 minutes, his dad came down with a rifle and 2 pistols. He gave me and Mitchell a pistol and a few more rounds of ammo and said, "You're going to need this. I have shot guns before, but I am not very experienced with them." Mitchell, on the other hand, is as his dad has taught him from a young age how to handle a firearm. We stayed downstairs and told him everything, but this time in detail. He didn't say anything but instead sat back in his chair, thinking about what to do. It was 3:50 a.m. by now, and the screams were still occurring around the farmhouse, and we still hadn't come up with a plan. By 4:30 a.m., we had our plan, which was to get into his dad's truck and search the area. His dad turned on all the lights surrounding the fields and attached his light strip to the top of his truck, and we set out looking for the creature. While in the truck, his dad told us that the scar on his leg wasn't from a football injury, but from the creature we had encountered. He told us that one night he heard the same screeching noise and went to investigate, but he wasn't fast enough to outrun the creature, and it cut his leg open. But luckily for him, a car was driving in his direction. He waved the car down and got in. He took his belt off and made a makeshift tourniquet with it to slow down the bleeding. He was driven to the hospital, where they were able to patch him up without removing his leg. Shortly after, he told us what really happened. We saw it, stood motionless in the beam of the truck's light. His dad shouldered his rifle and said, "Time to kill this son of a bitch." He shot the creature 4 times, 2 hitting the lower back and 1 hitting the upper shoulder. The creature collapsed to the ground and let out one more screech. But this one wasn't like the rest. It was louder, and you could hear the pain behind the screech. We drove to where it collapsed, and its blood was black. The creature was led into the long grass in a deformed position, breathing heavily. Its eyes were blue, and its skin was almost transparent. The black blood surrounded it and covered the grass around it. His dad shot him one more time in the head before he stopped moving altogether. We left the creature in the field, and we would deal with it the next day. It's the next day at around 12 p.m., and we decided to go see it. We walked to where it led, but to our surprise, nothing. The creature had vanished and hadn't left a trace. The black blood was no longer there, but the grass was flattened from where it had led. We knew it couldn't have moved, as the grass around it was untouched except for where we came through. We searched the property for at least 2 hours before we gave up. His dad drove me home that same day and told me not to tell a single soul about what I had encountered. I kept hearing the screeches every so often, and every time I heard them, I wouldn't sleep that night. I would stay up at night holding the pistol he gave me. This was 15 years ago, and I still have trouble dealing with it. I'm now 34 and have a wife and 2 kids. Mitchell is 34 as well and has a child with his fiancée. I still keep in contact with his dad, who is now 76. We don't bring up the night with each other, and when we hear the screeches together, we ignore them, but I know that when he hears them alone, he doesn't sleep either. I have always been afraid of mirrors, ever since I was a young child. I knew it was irrational, of course. I was never afraid when I would see my reflection in a puddle or on the darkened window of a shop as I walked down the street. It was specifically the mirrors that made me uncomfortable. I always feared that I would see something other than myself looking back at me. This explains why I was less than thrilled to find a large antique silver mirror in the bedroom of the house I was renting. Were it my own place, I would have thrown it out then and there, leaving it on the curb and relying solely upon the mirror in the modern and well-kept bathroom for all necessary reflective purposes. Alas, I didn't think my landlord would think too highly of his tenant tossing out expensive antique furniture, so I contented myself with simply moving it into a spare room. I had moved into the house for the simple reason that it was fairly cheap, and I didn't have much other choice. My husband passed away earlier that year due to a heart condition, leaving me simultaneously a widow and solely responsible for the care of my son, Chester. Fortunately, my husband's life insurance policy turned out to be reasonably generous, but I still needed to downgrade our living situation if I was to take care of Chester without another source of income. Beyond the obvious fact that I have now been left to raise a child without the assistance of a spouse, there is another reason why I cannot supplement my funds by taking on a job. Chester is autistic. I want to make it very clear that I'm not an autism mom. I loathe the self-absorbed whiners who spend every spare second complaining about the immense burden of raising an autistic child and who bellyache endlessly about how difficult their lives are. I hate all the videos of exasperated parents recording their child's meltdown on camera to show the world how difficult it is for them. I am disgusted whenever I see some selfish moron recommend ABA therapy to keep unruly autistic children's more unconventional behaviors in check. My son is not a cross to bear or a weight on my shoulders. He is my child, and I love him. I won't deny that it can be difficult sometimes, but I can only imagine how hard it is for him. I find the terms high functioning and low functioning to be relatively useless descriptors. Like most things in life, it is a tad more complicated than that. Chester is, generally speaking, nonverbal, and I've never known him to say more than 20 words in a single day. In addition, he tends to get overstimulated quite quickly from loud noises and often flaps his hands as a form of stimming, especially when he is having some difficulty expressing what he wants. The only behavior of his that ever actually frustrates me is his elopement, which in the context of autism means that he has a tendency to wander off or run away whenever he feels stressed. We work around these traits, and I think generally I've been able to make life quite comfortable for him. Chester has always shown quite an aptitude for reading and writing, despite his relatively young age of only 9 years old at the time we moved. When he needed something that could not be articulated through gestures or single words, he would write it down on a whiteboard I'd given him for this purpose. To help with his sensory issues regarding loud noises, I purchased a set of ear plugs for him, the same sort that one would wear at a gun range to prevent hearing loss. These generally aren't necessary within the confines of the house, but on those occasions when we do go out in public, I genuinely think they help him quite a bit. Given his condition, combined with the relative isolation of our new rural home, it has been necessary to homeschool Chester, though that hasn't really been any sort of problem. Before I got married, I spent a few years teaching elementary school, so I already have the required skills. I've always believed in a somewhat more active approach to learning than some of my peers, and since our new home is located directly next to a forest, this was fairly easy to accomplish. The house itself was rather old, built in the 1920s, if my landlord was to be believed. While recently renovated to a more modern standard at some point in the preceding decades, it still has an air of oldness to it, something in the angles and general structure of the place. The main feature that seemed significantly out of place was the wrought iron fence that surrounded the house, a far cry from the traditional wooden fence I was used to from my life in the suburbs. There was no formal gate that led out to the forest behind the house. There was just a gap in the fencing with a small pile of rusting iron posts nearby. I never asked the landlord about it, but judging by a stump outside the boundaries of the backyard, I assumed a tree must have fallen down and damaged it. Children don't want to sit still and be lectured. They want to be outside, to run around, and to be active. I'd always try to teach Chester his lessons in a way that connected to the forest. I'd lift up logs and show him all the squirming creatures underneath, so I could teach him all the differences between them. I'd have him count the rings of a fallen tree and teach him about the things that happened in the tree's long and storied life. I know that sometimes he would get bored, and while I do believe kids love learning, I'm not an idiot. I know that sometimes children just want to run and play, but I genuinely do believe he got more out of our lessons in the woods than he would have gotten from a traditional school environment. Even outside of the context of Chester's lessons, we spent a lot of time in those woods, slipping out through the gap in the fence into the forest beyond. There was something so peaceful about that place. It felt remarkably untouched by the civilization that bordered it. I'm not sure exactly how far the forest extended, but it always seemed to go on forever, like if you just kept walking, you could go the whole rest of your life surrounded by trees. I always kept a fairly close eye on Chester when we were out there. As much as I loved the place, I did often worry that he would simply run off, but there was never anything stressful enough in the woods to make him do so. The only real concern was to make sure he took off his shoes once he got back to the house, as otherwise he would track dirt inside, making quite the mess. Things went on as I described them for about a year after my husband's passing. In between caring for Chester and all the mundane errands of modern life, I attended therapy and worked to move on from the loss. I began to make peace with the fact that he was gone. Chester and I celebrated his 10th birthday out in the woods, moving to the backyard once night fell so we could finish off the evening roasting hot dogs over the fire pit, while I read him some relatively tame ghost stories. Chester didn't like scary movies or violent video games, but gently spooky stories, the sort that send a pleasant chill down your spine, made him quite happy. I believe I was reading out the mezzotint to him when we heard the music. It was a soft, strange sound, a faint piping emanating out from the forest beyond, gentle yet somehow eerie. The faint notes reminded me of the sound of panpipes, but not quite. If I listened very closely, I could almost discern a faint drumming as well. Chester looked out into the darkness beyond the fire, flapping his hands gently. He didn't seem upset or scared. He was just faintly awestruck. "Fairies," I heard him whisper. I felt somewhat uncomfortable as we both looked out into the blackness of the forest. The sound of crickets had died utterly as soon as the piping began, and we sat in silence, listening to that peculiar and otherworldly performance. It felt like something out of a dream, and I don't think it would be possible for me to recall the melody in any real detail. It was ephemeral somehow, slipping through the cracks of my memory like water through a sieve even as I listened. At some point, the music ceased, and the crickets returned to their chirping. I led Chester back inside and tucked him gently into bed. I've never been especially afraid of intruders, given how far away we were from any major population center, but that night I double-checked that all the doors and windows in the house were firmly locked. I didn't sleep well that night. I'll admit I'd still not gotten used to sleeping alone and often had difficulty falling asleep, but this felt different somehow. It seemed that whenever I was close to finally falling unconscious, I'd see a shadow pass across the wall or hear something just on the very edge of my perception, something that reminded me faintly of music. Whenever I'd jolt up in bed, looking or listening for what I thought had disturbed me, there was nothing there. At some point, I must have finally fallen asleep, because I found myself blinking out the daylight from my uncovered window, groggy and irritable. My skull throbbed with a terrible headache. My alarm clock hadn't gone off. It seemed to have become unplugged in the night. Possibly in my tossing and turning, the cord had somehow come out of the socket. It was late in the morning, far later than I usually wake up, and Chester was frustrated because he hadn't had breakfast yet. He didn't say anything, but he seemed glum and looked at me with justifiable annoyance and hunger. I did my best to prepare him some scrambled eggs and bacon, but in my pain and fatigue, I managed to burn the bacon and cook the eggs to an unpleasant, rubbery consistency. I deeply regret what happened next. I swore about the bacon, the eggs, the pan, the stove, the landlord, my dead husband, anyone and anything that could conceivably be somewhat to blame for the ruined breakfast. I know it was wrong to react like that in front of my son. I know it was immature, but I was tired and in pain, and I just wished desperately I could go back to bed. When I'd finished with my profanity-laced rant, I heard the back door closing and looked out the window to see Chester fleeing out into the forest, visibly distressed. "Shit," I muttered to myself, and I ran out the door after him, calling for him to come back. I tripped on one of the fallen iron fence posts and fell to the ground, knocking the air from my lungs. When I recovered enough to stand up, Chester was long gone, vanished among the trees. I looked through those woods for hours. As I described earlier, I don't know how large the forest behind my house is, but it still feels odd that in all that time I never saw him. Chester's only 10 years old. He isn't some sort of Olympic sprinter, and the foliage isn't so thick that I could have lost him that easily. I kept wandering among the trees, shouting out Chester's name with increasing panic. Sometimes I thought I'd hear a branch snapping or a child's giggle, and I would turn about, desperately trying to catch a glimpse of the sound source. But there would be nothing there. It was fairly late in the afternoon when I finally decided to head back and call the police. Despite how long I'd spent in the forest, it was a remarkably quick walk back to the house. It felt almost as if the walk into the woods was somehow farther than the walk out. I opened the door and started moving to the bedroom to get my phone when I suddenly saw Chester sitting on the couch, reading a book. I nearly wept with relief and rushed to hug him, apologizing over and over for scaring him and asking if he was okay. I was so happy to see my son again that I wasn't even angry with him for running off. "I'm all right, Mom. I'm really sorry for running off. I was just scared. I won't do that again. Please don't be angry," said Chester, tears welling up in his eyes. I froze. Chester rarely spoke more than a single word at a time. His longest sentences, which I could remember before this, were maybe 3 or 4 words long at most. This was utterly unprecedented, and I had no idea how to react whatsoever. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, looking at me with a confused look on his face. The next week went by very strangely. To be very clear, autism isn't something that just goes away. It's not a disease. It's not something that can be cured. And yet, Chester no longer showed any signs of his previous behavior whatsoever. His personality seemed intact. The sort of things he now spoke aloud seemed relatively in keeping with the sentences he would have previously written on the whiteboard. He still had the same love of reading and the same interest in ghost stories, and he still played with the same toys. In all respects, he was the exact same boy as before. Simply put, now he was neurotypical. He didn't have to wear earplugs out in public anymore. And true to his word, he never ran off when under stress. He didn't even flap his hands. He just kept them calmly at his sides. It was totally surreal. One day I was teaching him his lessons out in the woods, and he told me, "Mom, I think I'd want to go to regular school. I want to be with the other kids." I was completely taken aback. Chester had never shown even the slightest interest in going to a public school before this, and on the few occasions he'd had to interact with other children, he'd been far too shy to play with them. Of course, I told him I'd be happy to send him to school. What else was I supposed to say? That night, I sent emails to the nearest schools in the area, asking about late enrollment. It was the second week after Chester's sudden and unprecedented transformation that I began to notice something else that was strange. Despite the fact that we were spending a decent amount of time outside in the woods, Chester never left any dirty footprints in the house anymore. It wasn't that he had suddenly become more careful about taking his shoes off. He was still running inside with his sneakers on, just as he always had, but there was never any dirt or mud. I just assumed at the time that he must have been wiping his shoes off while I wasn't looking, and in all honesty, I didn't pay it much mind. It's only in retrospect, knowing what I do now, that this sticks out in my mind. He also didn't eat very much anymore. He didn't snack at all, and whenever I prepared him his meals, he only ate very small portions. He never showed any signs of weakness or that he was losing weight, so I didn't bother him about it. There would be no point in forcing him to eat more than he wanted to, but it did strike me as very odd. It wasn't until the incident with the mirror that I realized that it wasn't my son. I was looking for some books I'd packed away in cardboard boxes in the spare room. There wasn't a lot of space on the bookshelf in the living room, so I tended to switch out the books on a semi-regular basis for ones kept in the spare room, aside from a handful of mainstays. It was while I was doing so that Chester walked over to the doorway and asked me where I had put his toy robot. I looked up from what I was doing to answer him when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. something deeply wrong. It was the old silver mirror, pointed towards the doorway. It wasn't reflecting my son's. I turned to look closer, my words dying on my lips as I gazed at the figure in the mirror. The old terror I'd always felt looking into such things resurfacing suddenly and violently. The thing was dressed in Chester's clothes, but that was about the only real resemblance it bore to him. It was a crude marionette, carved from untreated and unpainted wood, with clumps of bark still clinging to it in places. The mouth had a jaw like that of a ventriloquist dummy, albeit with crooked teeth made from sharp flints jammed into the wood. I saw bits of old food stuck to the teeth and mouth, remnants of meals I had cooked earlier in the day. The eyes were simple holes with bits of colored glass, like marbles, held within. It was suspended above the ground by an inch or two of thick brown twine, like the sort one would use to close a package in the days before packing tape. I stared in stunned silence at the mirror before turning around, only to find Chester standing there, head cocked slightly in confusion. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, with concern in his voice. I turned once again to the mirror, seeing the horrible puppet thing once again. I wanted to vomit as I watched its jaw work up and down mockingly. "I'm sorry. I'll find it myself. I didn't mean to bother you," it said, before jerkily walking down the hallway to Chester's bedroom. That night I watched Chester carefully in the bathroom mirror when he brushed his teeth, but there didn't seem to be anything strange about him at all. He moved like a person, not a puppet, and when I gently squeezed his shoulder, I felt flesh and bone underneath the fabric of his clothes, not hard wood and bark. I didn't sleep. As creepy as it may sound, I just sat in Chester's room and watched that thing lay in bed, snoring. It seemed to be asleep. I stayed there all night, just watching, until it woke up the next morning, asking me what I was doing. I didn't respond, and I left without making breakfast. It's not like it would have needed it. I wasn't even sure where I was going at first. I was just driving to clear my head. I eventually realized I was en route to an antique store the next town over. I'd visited the store a few times before, looking for bits of furniture and the like immediately after moving. I didn't know why I was headed there now, but it felt almost as if I were being drawn there somehow. I pulled into the parking lot and left my car, pushing through the shop's door with the tinkling of a bell. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I just wandered the store in a daze, looking around at all the various bits of junk and knickknacks with disinterest. The whole store reeked of musty books and wood polish, the smell lulling me into a sort of trance as I meandered among the shelves stacked with discarded history. Eventually, though, I found something that struck my eye. It was a small old hand mirror with the telltale tarnishing of real silver. It seemed to call to me somehow, and in my numbed state, I didn't even fear the blank-eyed reflection that looked back at me. I picked it up and looked at the price tag. $50. More than it was worth, but not too unreasonable. I picked it up and brought it to the counter, paying in cash. The store's proprietor, a thin old woman with graying hair and enormous spectacles, chuckled at me as she called me up. "Planning on making a vampire hunting kit, ma'am?" she asked. "What?" I replied, the completely bizarre question startling me out of my stupor. "Just a little joke. Halloween's coming up, and once a few years ago, I had a gentleman come in here and buy up all sorts of strange stuff. I asked him what he needed it for, and he told me he was going to dress up as Abraham Van Helsing for the occasion. He said he was making a vampire hunting kit. One of the items he bought was an old hand mirror, rather like this one. He asked me if it was real silver, and I told him yes, but when he asked why that mattered, I figured silver was always the sort of thing one would use for werewolves, not vampires. He told me that the reason why vampires didn't show their reflections in mirrors was that in the old days they were made of silver, and that silver was a symbol of purity. He said that if vampires were real and walking about nowadays, they'd be reflected back just fine since nearly all modern mirrors are made with aluminum. Doesn't tarnish, I suppose. My mind flashed to Chester brushing his teeth in the bathroom mirror, his face as normal as it could be reflecting back at me, before recalling the terrifying thing I'd seen in the old silver mirror. The old woman must have noticed me go pale. She asked me if I was all right. I nodded and left with the mirror, driving back home. I got back around lunchtime, and the thing that pretended to be my son asked me if I was okay, and if we would be having lunch soon. I angled the mirror so I could see its face, and I saw that crude puppet mouth widening in vague time with its speech. I told it to wait at the dinner table, and that I would be with it in a few minutes. It did as I said, sitting down and pretending to read a book with its glass eyes. I reached into the kitchen drawer and pulled out a pair of butcher's scissors. With the scissors in one hand and the hand mirror in the other, I walked up behind the puppet thing, carefully angling the mirror so I could see where the strings connected to its wooden body. I looked to see where the strings led, to see if I could get a glance at the puppeteer, but they just seemed to extend impossibly into the ceiling, passing through the plaster like a fishing line through water. It didn't notice what I was doing until I'd already cut the first string, one connected to its left arm. It screeched in what sounded like pain, a horrible, distorted cry that was a mix of mad piping and a child's scream. It swiped at me with the right arm, but I was too fast for it. After all, it was only wood and strings, and I was alive. I cut the other arm free, and both now fell limp at their sides. Next, I went for the legs, snipping the strings in quick succession. Glancing up from the mirror, I saw what looked like my son floating in the air slightly, mouth wide open, as it screamed. I cut the strings that connected its jaw and head, and the thing collapsed to the floor in a silent heap. The illusion had been broken, and all that lay before me was a broken puppet. Far away in the distance, I could hear the sound of pipes playing faintly in the woods, a haunting melody that I cannot quite recall. I knew I couldn't go to the police with any of this. Who would believe a woman who claimed that her son had been replaced by a puppet? I'd be institutionalized at best and arrested for child abuse at worst, and that's assuming they ever managed to find the real Chester. I spent the rest of the day frantically researching on the internet, typing inane phrases like child replaced puppet music pipes or puppet mirror child double into the search engine, getting almost nothing useful in response, until eventually I came across some old website detailing European folklore. Specifically, the page on changelings I read about medieval peasants who were convinced their children had been replaced with those of fairies, and how their real children had been taken to the woods to be raised by the monsters that stole them. I read of the ways one could protect oneself from the so-called fair folk and their hatred of iron. I remembered the wrought iron fence that surrounded the house and the conspicuous gap where a tree must have broken through as it fell. I've written this in case I don't come back. I've written this so that if I'm never found, they don't think I just performed a murder-suicide in the woods out of grief. I love my son dearly, and I am going to save him from the monsters that took him from me. I can hear the hideous music of their eldritch pipes drifting through the trees, mocking me. I'm taking one of the broken iron posts with me. The tip is sharp as a spear. I can remember my mom fell down the stairs and into a laundry basket, where she shrank. She wasn't my mom anymore after that. I was 5, and she didn't fall. Some people came and took her away. Cops or doctors, I guess. I went to live with an old lady in a dirty house decorated with discarded cigarette butts and walls painted with nicotine. She occupied the living room in a cloud of second-hand neglect and made me call her grandma. The upstairs basement, better known to non-children as the attic, was the only place in the house that didn't stink. I'd steal a package of bologna from the fridge and flee Grandma's wrath. I wasn't allowed in the kitchen. She never forgot to feed me because she never remembered in the first place. Whining about it had earned me a whack across the wrist from her cane. The bologna escape plan had been refined to procedure. Up the stairs to my room, into the closet where an old dresser had been shoved. Climb on the dresser, jump up into the open attic panel and grab a hold of the floor edge above. Pull oneself up. Slide the attic panel back over the access point. Listen to Grandma clomp and shout, and eventually quit looking for you. Eat bologna in the dark. I'd stored other food up here too, like cookies and crackers, and quickly learned I wasn't the only one living in the attic. Mice would chew through anything and wouldn't ask before moving into the pillow I'd stolen from Grandma's bed. It was like Cinderella, but with poop everywhere. The day I found a flashlight beside the bologna in the fridge was the day I cried for my mother. I couldn't quite remember what she looked like. The vague features of her face were permanently etched with paranoia. She was afraid of monsters. That's what I thought. I remember praying they'd leave her alone. As I stared at the end of the light beam, I clearly remembered her falling down the stairs. Her heels slid over the edge of the carpeted steps. She landed in a crouch in the laundry basket. The shrinking was subtle, minor, even. Her tongue fell out of her wide-open mouth, like she'd bitten it during the fall. She looked up at me intensely, and then, it seemed, not at all, as if the capacity to be worried had been exceeded. The last embers of her fire were extinguished, and she ceased to be my mother because she wasn't anyone after that. Somehow, her mind had been reduced to a blank slate. I blamed myself. I cried until I fell asleep on the baby mattress I'd dragged into the attic. The flashlight was still on when I awoke. Mice were trying to approach my food pile. They crawled in irregular spurts, imitating dead leaves blowing across the ground, and would suddenly squeak and run away when they got too close. The flashlight revealed a line of soot drawn around the food. I don't remember organizing the supplies. I may have. But I know I didn't make that circle. Had it been there the whole time? And why were the mice afraid to cross it? Naturally, I put everything mice might eat or poop on inside the dark circle. I lived by the flashlight and only left the attic to use the bathroom and shower when Grandma would take her weekly trip to the grocery store. On one such excursion, I heard her complaining about a large icicle that had formed on the eavesdrow. Sure as hell, it could kill a fool. She shouted at someone outside. She grumbled more about the city not helping the elderly enough. I went outside for the first time in many days to see it. As cruel and indifferent as Grandma was, she was not exaggerating about the icicle. In my head, I thought it resembled a large knife, a nifical. Judging by its position on the eavesdrow, it grew right outside a window where I lived in the attic. I'd never noticed a shuttered window before, but I immediately ran inside to check. Sure enough, it was there, above my reach, at the opposite end of the attic where I'd made camp. There were boxes of Christmas decorations, and more clutter than I'd guessed. I found a chair to stand on and struggled to turn the slats, which had been painted over several times. I pushed too hard, and my slender arm destroyed a section of rotting wood. My hand plunged beyond. My fingers wrapped around the nifical instinctively. The ice was smooth, and I could sense its weight and destructive potential. If it didn't stab when it fell, it would still crush an individual below. I retracted my arm and looked outside through the hole, and at the hilt of the knife. I felt armed, powerful, and ashamed. Grandma was messed up and confused, but she didn't deserve to die. Even a 6-year-old could understand that. I climbed down from the chair and saw that daylight had been admitted through the broken slat. I turned off the flashlight until nightfall. A scream woke me up. Grandma was shouting, swearing, and breaking things on the first floor. The attic seemed to vibrate from the severe impacts below. I held my breath and listened. "You think you can hide?" she roared, punctuating the question with the sound of shattering glass. The rest of her tirade couldn't breach the second floor. The ranting and the destruction seemed to last hours, but concluded with a more unsettling quiet. I didn't know what it had been about, or what the final outcome had been. I kept still on the baby mattress until dawn, when I finally risked peeing into a metal pan I'd found in the attic. I heard Grandma's car start and pull away. It's time for a wash and a kitchen raid. Lowering the pee bucket onto the dresser first, I then dropped beside it as quietly as a cat. I used a wet cloth on my face and pits and drank as much water as I could handle from the tap. I stopped at the top of the stairs to view an intense fog of cigarette smoke. It filled the entire first floor, which didn't strike me as impossible at the time. My simple mind thought Grandma's smoke hadn't disappeared because the windows and doors were always closed. It was winter. The smoke couldn't get out. The picture frames had been knocked off the walls, with shattered glass piled at the bottom. I wasn't wearing shoes, so I leaped over the shards, stayed low when I landed, and listened. Nothing. I moved swiftly into the kitchen, noting the overturned table and broken lamp in the hall. The living room door stood open, which was rare. Grandma liked her privacy. I don't know why I didn't just stay focused on the fridge. Crossing the antique threshold of her favored space felt like I'd breached the lair of a dragon. The nicotine stench stung my nostrils and burned my eyes. An electric fireplace from the 1970s switched between two fake flames, while a vent pumped too much heat. I began to sweat. The TV played a soap opera on an empty reclining chair and a plastic-covered couch. A small pile of tobacco and rolling papers looked to have been abandoned abruptly. Yet there was no other sign of vandalism in the rest of the house. Perhaps something or someone had drawn her here. Since I couldn't see anything worthwhile to take, I left slowly. Something didn't feel right. I closed the door, forgetting it had been open. When I reached for the handle to set it right, it turned on its own. I backed away. She hadn't been inside. No one had. Nevertheless, the door opened outward, and there she stood. It's difficult to recall her exact appearance. I remember her teeth decaying nearly to the gums, and the wet interior of her mouth was a stark contrast to the dry, powdery skin on her wrinkled face. Her dark eyes were so sunken into the aged flesh that they looked like a shark's. I don't remember what she wore or the state of her body. She seemed neither fat nor thin. It's the face that remains the clearest. That and the fact that she could walk the tip of her cane jabbed my baby toe, and I hopped back. She pushed open the door and swung, the cane shaft running across the top of my hair. I ran for the stairs. "Get back here," she demanded. I made the mistake of glancing over my shoulder as I rounded the banister and stepped right onto the broken glass I'd carefully avoided before. Pain shot through the arch of my foot, and my sock turned red. Grandma's rough arm wrapped around my neck, and I suddenly couldn't breathe. Despite her age, her strength exceeded mine by a lot. My small hand slapped ineffectually at her. She breathed a hot, fetid breath into my ear as she spoke. "Don't you see? You're going to die here." The pressure on my neck intensified. I was about to pass out, but somehow, I think she must have adjusted her chokehold. My chin slipped below her forearm. I didn't want to die. Without hesitation, I sank my teeth into her skin until blood filled my mouth, and she finally let go. This time, I didn't look back. I ran up the stairs, ignoring the pain in my foot. There was so much blood, I slipped on the dresser leading to the attic. Grandma switched on the bedroom light as she stomped into the room. We exchanged the briefest look before she rushed for the closet. Her hand closed around my injured foot as I pulled myself up. The blood gushing from the wound saved me. Her fingers slid down my calf to my sock, which came off easily. I put the panel over the access and sat on it. She pecked with her cane but gave up fast. "Let it be your tomb then," she seethed before clomping away. I reached the baby mattress with my foot and pulled it over the panel. Then I piled everything I could find except the food, which I left in the black soot circle. "Your foot. Don't forget your foot." It was like someone had whispered the advice directly to my brain. The wound kept bleeding, and I felt sick. I started to panic and cry, and I desperately wished my mom would save me. "Don't cry. You're going to be okay. Take the blanket and wrap it around the cut." Except for the first suggestion, I did as recommended. "Now press your hands down on the blanket." It hurt to do so, but I did it, and soon the bleeding stopped, as did my tears. "Listen, that woman is bad. She intends to kill you." Panic seized my body again. "Listen." A kind of jolt went through me. "When you hear her car again, go to the window and put your hand against the icicle." "Nifical," I said, and I had the strangest feeling that whatever was speaking to me smiled. What a creative, smart child. I beamed. Then the sound of Grandma's car came from outside. Hurry. It wasn't easy to walk or climb the chair with my hurt foot. The niffle felt wet in the afternoon sun. Wait. The nagging feeling I'd had before, that something wasn't the way it should be, came again. Something is wrong, I said. My child's brain struggled to connect the scattered details. The engine quieted. A car door slammed shut. Periodic squeaking followed once, twice, and 3 times, and there was grunting from some kind of effort. Grandma was struggling to do something. 1 more second. No, I don't want to. I began to retract my arm. You will die. Do you understand? She intends for you to die. You have no choice. Do you want to die? I did not. My hand felt the base of the niffle. Push. Now. The base of the large icicle came away from the eavesdrove so quietly and so easily. Sour acid filled my stomach. A soft impact preceded the clattering of steel on wood and concrete. She let out a dismayed cry for help soon after. I pulled my arm in and looked out at the empty sky while she continued to wail. I climbed down off the chair and moved quickly to the panel, tossing my junk and the mattress aside. Where are you going? Something isn't right. I couldn't express the obvious any better. No, don't go. I ignored the voice and found my way to the front porch. My remaining sock drank in the wet snow. The wound on my foot felt better against the cold surface. An old woman lay beside her overturned wheelchair at the bottom of a ramp. Blood matted her white hair. Her teeth weren't rotted. They were white, probably dentures. A package of bologna and a box of cookies lay beside her, as did batteries for my flashlight. Are you okay? She asked. Did you see that? The big icicle hit me in the head. She tried and failed to get up to a seated position. Niffle, I said. Huh. Her eyes scanned the eavesdrove where the icicle had been. She saw the hole in the window slot and looked back at me with a worried face. The realization of my betrayal, unintentional as it was, hit us both at the same time. That's when she shrank. I learned then what had really happened to my mother the day she fell down the stairs. Nothing. Not to her. It happened to me. I rose into the air, but it didn't feel like I was being lifted. The subtle decrease in Grandma's size, and my mother's in the past, was my own perception getting further away. The fear and worry leaked from her expression. This was beyond her ability to remedy. She wasn't my grandma anymore. On a backward trajectory, I floated into the house, carried by something I didn't understand then and don't fully understand now. I only know that when the door slammed shut, I began to resist. Stop it. I writhed against the air. No, stop it. I can help you. I protected you from her. Grandma wanted to hurt you. Kill you. The whispers in my head became a discordant choir of suffering people. Whatever entity forced their voices into a singularity was losing control. That wasn't Grandma. I finally understood. You are. I dropped to the floor, free for the moment. I drew in a big breath and noticed the change in the house immediately. The nicotine coating had lifted, and the odor was gone. Daylight poured through windows I hadn't noticed before. There was no door barring the living room, which also appeared more inviting. The electric fireplace was gone, and the television was modern, flat, and hung on the wall. Also, it was off. The destructive debris from earlier was missing too, except for the shards of glass in front of the stairs. I was confused and seemed to drift to my room automatically. Getting the door open, however, proved difficult. Something blocked the way, allowing only what proved to be a meager gap for my admission. Inside the bedroom lay the encampment I thought I'd made in the attic. The mattress was a twin with bedding and a pillow. I had apparently removed it from the bed frame. There were spots of blood on the carpet, which made me remember my foot. The fact I'd forgotten tipped me off to the reduced severity of the wound. There was a cut, and my sock was still missing, but it wasn't gushing blood and probably never had been. The food pile was in a corner, confined to the black circle. I touched what had been soot, It was wax from crayons. There is only one place left to check. I climbed the dresser in the closet and found it more difficult to ascend into the attic than expected. When I managed to catch the lip of the floor above, my fingers brushed fuzz. A dead mouse, deceased for some time, lay silent near the opening. The chair beneath the window was, to my disappointment, the same. I had almost killed that old lady. She bought me bologna, cookies, and other food. I sat down and cried until a man in a uniform came up to collect me. I was brought to a social worker who had a lot of questions and wanted to know what had happened. She listened and wrote on a notepad, and when I finished, she gently corrected me on a number of subjects. I was not 6, but 8. The old woman really was my grandma. I'd lived with her for years already. She'd been instructed to give me space. My mother had not been well. Apparently, neither was I. My grandmother recovered and welcomed me back in, though she seemed distant and understandably cautious. I attended therapy and progressed well. I went to school, made friends, and usually believed the previous incident had been due to repressed trauma. Only the empty space where the picture frame had been and my missing sock nagged at me. I hadn't imagined those things. My therapist suggested I'd simply misinterpreted ordinary events, and I might have accepted that explanation if not for the occasional and fierce sensation that all was still not well. This feeling would be validated years later, when the memory of these days was firmly rationalized and sealed with medication. The entity tried again, but even that incident wouldn't be the one to kick off my investigation into Bridal Veil Lake. That couldn't begin until I understood that evil really does exist. It isn't a metaphor or some subjective truth. It's real and begins with them. Call them demons if you like, though it's probably an oversimplification. Some see themselves as angels, and the rest don't bother to define what they are because they simply don't care. I won't be upset if you don't believe me. I couldn't accept it until one of them targeted someone else. Someone better than me, someone I loved and always will love. Wherever they are right now, I hope they are relatively safe in a world where no one can be.